Hi everyone. So now we are having Jayanko. Jayanko is working with a Codilayer as a team lead or a developer or a maintainer. He is going to share about a very interesting topic, which is a headless Magento. Nowadays, it's very like a popular topic, and everybody working in this. And this session will help developers and merchants as well, because he's going to share about like how to write the code and which key pointers you have to keep in mind when you are developing anything. So over to you, Jainko. Good luck.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Manish. So let me just start by saying a very good morning. And unfortunately, for the circumstances, we're going to have to talk to each other through a glass screen. But I'm going to hope that all of you are there, and I'm going to hope that you enjoy this presentation. So, with that, just sit back, relax, and let's get started. So let me start by saying that my name is Jayanka Ghosh, but some of you might know me as Joy from my YouTube channel Image Cafe, the YouTube videos which I make. And this session which I'm going to be giving, the topic will be writing code for headless Magento. So it's not going to be about the coding standards, or it's not going to be about like this is what you have to write, this is what you don't have to write. It's more about the key points which you have to keep in mind, and the key let's say the key checklist which you have to keep in your mind whenever you're writing code, so that you don't have to struggle when you go with headless Magento. So we'll come to that in the upcoming slides. But before we get started with this topic, let me just start by introducing myself a little bit. So firstly, I love to play the guitar. I'm really into rock and metal music, but that's not why we're here. So let's move on. I work as a team lead in Codilar Technologies. So I joined Codilar in I think 2016, and from then I'm working with Codilar Technologies. I also run a YouTube channel called Mage Cafe. So if you have not checked it out, please do. Mage Cafe, we basically we make videos. I would say beginner to intermediate videos on tutorial videos on Magento 2, and recently we're making on PWA and PWA implementations with Magento as well. And finally, like I said, so I helped build and maintain a tool called Next PWA. This is the website if you want to check it out later. So Next PWA is a React based Magento 2 PWA theme, which is built on top of Scandi PWA. So when we were working on this, the reason why I chose this topic, and the reason why I think I would be a perfect candidate to talk to you about the main challenges of headless Magento and writing code for headless Magento, is because I personally, when I was working on this, I faced a lot of challenges, which I would say I made the mistakes which I don't want you guys to make, which is why I'm giving this presentation to you, which is what we're going to be talking about, what we should keep in mind. So that's a little bit about me. Now let's come to the topic. Let's jump right in. So firstly, what is headless Magento? And if you see, I have written headless in this quotation because it's a very interesting word, headless. Uh, the simplest example or the simplest definition which I can give you for headless Magento would be that a system in which the head of the system and the body of the system are separate, are completely separate. They don't talk to each other directly. They rather talk to each other through a bridge. So what do I mean by the head of the system? What do I mean by the body of the system? The simplest examples which we know are PWA implementations. So if we take that example, you'll see that the front end is usually written in a different language. It's usually for websites is usually a JavaScript based language like React, Angular, Vue, some of these languages. And for the backend, it's for Magento, it's written in PHP. It's a Magento system, and they communicate with each other through either, let's say, REST APIs, or more recently we are seeing GraphQL. So this kind of a system in which like in traditional systems, we used to have sessions where the front end remembered the backend's configuration, and we used to pass data back and forth easily. That is not something which happens in a headless system, which is why people face the main challenges. So that's what a headless Magento would be. Some of the examples which I can give you would be PWAs, obviously. So any PWA implementation with backend as Magento is a headless implementation. You can also have native apps. It need not be PWAs. You can have an Android application or an iOS application running separately with Magento as the backend. So that can also be an example of a headless Magento. You can also have like a simple web service where probably you're running a POS system where Magento is just used as a web service system. That can also serve as a headless Magento. So now what we will be talking about is basically what developers should keep in mind, or rather what think I would have kept in mind, should have kept in mind when I was making next PWA when writing code for a headless system. So let's start with that. The first one is, I think most of you know this, but if you don't, it's a very important thing. Don't rely on sessions. If you write code, if you're writing code for a traditional theme, let's say your front end theme, which we usually know of, for that sessions will work fine. But then when you shift to PW implementation or some headless implementations, everywhere where you used session, you're going to have to rewrite the code to make it work for PWAs. So a simple example, the most simple example which I can give you is, let's say you want to get the customer's ID. So I'm going a little bit technical here. Let's say you want the customer's ID. This, I think, is the sure short way in which we usually get the ID. We load the customer session. We call the sessions get customer ID. We get the customer's ID if the customer is logged in. But when you write this, let's say you wrote this in 5 or 6 different places, but then if you want that same code, that same extension to work with GraphQL, for example, it will not, because in a headless system, session is not there. Instead of session, the customer's authentication happens through tokens. So you're going to have to then check if it's front end system, then you have to use the session. If it's a back end system, you have to use the tokens. It becomes a little bit harder to manage. So instead of that, instead of this, use this. So very simple examples. Instead of using the customer session, use the user context interface, and you can get the customer ID like this. And one of the main beauty of the user context interface, which I would say, is that if you're using user context interface in the front end, it would take your front end session, it will take your customer ID from the session. And if you're using the same thing on a different scope, like let's say you're using this on the web API underscore REST scope, or web API SOAP scope, or GraphQL scope, in that case it will take it from the token. So you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to write 2 separate code bases to make the same thing work. You can just use the same code and it will work. So that's one thing. So this is one of the examples. The thing which I'm trying to say is, do not use sessions anywhere. Try to find an alternative to sessions. If you want to save some data in the session, instead of sessions, try to save it in the database, some table in the database, and use some tokens to basically authenticate that data back and forth to the user. Or if you want to save something which is very device specific, use the local storage. For websites, use the local storage, or something similar, some alternative of it, so that you don't have to worry about this data coming back and forth. The second thing is, so this is also something which you guys will know, but again, it's very important, which is separate your business logic from the UI. What I'm trying to say is that whenever you're writing some business logic, do not write it in the block, because block is a part of the layout system, the MVC system. It's part of the V system, the view system. It has layout, block, and template. If you write something in the block to do something, which we would have done sometime, what happens is it becomes difficult for using that code later on, because block cannot be used without a UI context. So it becomes a little bit difficult to reuse it. Either we have to write the same thing again, or we'll have to extend the block and it becomes ugly. So instead of that, try to use helpers, or try to use some data providers which you see in GraphQL modules, or try to use an additional model class which has the business logic. Call that in your block, call that in your REST APIs, and call that in your GraphQL data providers, and use the same thing in different places. You can reuse your code very easily. The third thing is service contracts. So it's not exactly the third thing, it's more of an extension of the second thing which I was saying. So do not write your code in the UI level. So service contracts are basically a standardization. So before service contracts, people might some of you might write your business logic in a helper. The helper's naming convention might be different for different developers. Some of you might write it in a model, some of you might write it in a different place. So to standardize that, what Magento came up with are service contracts. So service contracts, if you see in every Magento's module, there basically are a set of interfaces, and each of these interfaces are basically the service contract for that module, for that extension, and they do a particular set of operations which are reused in different places, and which are basically the set of operations which we can do for that extension. So if I take an example, let's say I take an example of uh, let's say we're making an extension where we are saving the vendor's information. So sort of a marketplace where we're saving the vendor's first name, last name, email, URL, profile image, etc. So in that case, you'll have a repository interface in your API. So repository interfaces are basically for doing the direct CRUD operation. So directly create, read, update, or delete. So in the example of the vendor, I would say you can have getting the vendor by their ID, getting the vendor by their email, or creating a new vendor, or updating a vendor, saving a vendor basically. Then you can have deleting a vendor, you can have getting a list of vendors from a collection. All of these functionalities can be under your repository interface. The other type of service contract which you will see commonly are the management interfaces. So management interfaces, again, the same example if I take, let's say when you are creating a vendor, you don't just put an entry in the database. Instead of that, maybe you first put an entry on the database, you add the vendor, then maybe you send an email to the vendor saying welcome to this Magento store. Then maybe you send an email to the admin saying this vendor has registered, and maybe you send an SMS to the vendor saying that this is the link, click on it to verify your mobile number. So a lot of different things are happening, not only one CRUD operation, but a set of complex operations, a set of complex pipelines are happening. So those kinds of things, instead of putting it in a repository, which are more like raw data, you put it in your management interfaces. And in your management interface, usually you call the repositories. And this flow ensures that you can have a very reusable code, which you can use in all of your scopes. You can use it in your backend, front end, GraphQL, REST APIs as well. So try to go with service contracts. Every module you make, try to make a service contract for it. Then we have, so till now we're talking about new data. Whenever we're writing new data, now what if we want to modify some existing, or what I'm saying is we're talking about whenever we're writing new extensions to add new tables or new functionality into Magento. But what if we want to modify data? So for modifications as well, the most common mistake which I see, and I saw this even on some pretty good extensions by some pretty good vendors as well, I won't name any, but I am sure you know what I'm talking about. Basically, we see that manipulation takes place on the template files. Many of the times we manipulate data on the template. That should never be the case. So if I take an example of, let's say you're making an extension where the price of the product which you're showing on the listing page will change based on some logic. So instead of changing that directly on the template file, or let's say we want to hide or show the price based on some logic, so usually we do that on the, or we tend to do that, we have the urge to do that on the template files, on the PHTML files. But the problem then is, if you want to extend that same logic, and if you want to uh, sorry, if you want to extend the logic, if you want to extend the same thing in a PWA or a headless implementation, we cannot do that. Sorry, let me go back. Yeah, so we cannot do that. So instead of that, instead of doing stuff on a PHTML, always try to use preferences, observers, and plugins. Keep the template files only for UI. Do not use the template files for anything else. The other thing, the other part of this is, if you're writing a plugin or an observer, try to write it for a model or a repository. So if you write it for a controller, if you're changing data on a controller, then for a REST API or for a GraphQL, there is no concept of controllers. All of them enter the same controller. So your change will go away. You will have to write the same thing again. So instead of that, if you change the data directly on the model level, that same thing will work without you having to do anything. So one more point which I would like to add here is, let's say you want to do something only on one specific scope. You want to do some change only on the front end. You don't want to do it on the GraphQL, or you want to do it only on GraphQL. You don't want that to happen on the REST API, for example. For that, we have separate scopes. The di.xml or the events.xml which you write, you can write it on that specific scope, and it will work only on that scope. If you write it in GraphQL, it will not reflect in your front end. So reuse those things, reuse these functionalities, so that you have a very stable and well performing code. The next thing is, so this is very specific to GraphQL, and you will not see this happening for REST APIs. This is that separate the GraphQL implementation from the original module. So in REST APIs, Magento has not done that, mostly because for REST APIs, there is no specific implementation. There is no separate implementation. For REST APIs, what happens is, if you write the service contracts, which I've explained previously, If you write the service contracts properly, it will work without us having to make any changes for REST APIs. But for GraphQL, you will see, if you see Magento's vendor directory, you will see things like these. You will see a module Braintree and a module Braintree GraphQL. You will see a module CMS and a module CMS GraphQL. So what happens here is becomes very easy for us to structure our code, number one, and number two, it becomes easy for other people to understand which modules of us support GraphQL. So always try to separate these two, separate the main module separately and the GraphQL implementation separately, which will only have the GraphQL data providers, the schema.graphql file, and stuff like that. So separate your GraphQL implementation from the original module. And then this, I would say, is the most silly, most vague, yet the best advice which I can give you from personal experience, which is that whenever you're writing code, think headless. What I mean by think headless is that whenever you're writing code, do not stop at the layout.xml. Do not just think about how the layout will behave and don't stop there. Instead of that, you add the web api.xml, add the schema.graphql. So if you don't know, the web API is for the REST APIs and the schema.graphql is for the GraphQL. So make those files and make those implementations. Even if you're not using those implementations at the moment, you might use it later on. So if you followed the advice which I've told you previously, the implementing these two things should not be a huge hassle. Your actual code should be able to very easily extend to having support for GraphQL and REST API as well. So try to implement these even if you're not using it. What that does is that forces us to think, because we are implementing that, that forces us to think in a headless way. And when we think in a headless way, we write code for a headless system, and it behaves well in a headless system as well, because all of us are very much experienced in how to write code for a traditional theme, for a traditional front end. But if we think headless, if we write headless, then our code will become better in a headless system. So that was all I had to share. So it was a pretty short presentation. If you have any queries, and obviously if you want to have a cup of coffee with me, I'm always available. So this is my LinkedIn, and if LinkedIn's not your thing, you can always write to me at joy@codilar.com. I'll reply to you as soon as possible. We at Codilar are also looking for enthusiastic people to join our team. So if you're interested in that, you can also write at recruiter@codilar.com, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you. I'll take the questions now.
Thanks, Joy. Thank you for sharing very insightful session. This is like a fully technical sessions, not to use the
Yeah.
session, separate business logics from block, service contracts use, modification of the data should not be at UI level. So it's
Yeah.
quite a good session for every developer, I think. And thank you for this. We are having some questions as well.
Mhm.
So let me take the first question is, do you think that headless Magento will become the standard in future years?
So I think the person who spoke before me, he also had a pretty interesting take on it. So I think I agree with him that whether it will become a standard or not is something which we can only predict right now. We can't say for sure. But from the recent trends, what we are seeing is more and more people are adapting to a headless system. So be it PWAs, which is becoming a huge trend right now, or be it native apps where people can have more control of the devices. Because nowadays, most people actually view from their phones. And when I say most, I mean probably 80% of people will view their devices or view their websites from their phones. So to have a good experience on the phones, it's good to move from that traditional system to a PWA system, which requires headless. So if you ask me, I would bet that yes, it would become a standard in the future.
Nice. All right. Yeah. Next question we have, what do you think the main connector will be, GraphQL or React?
So here, GraphQL is a separate thing and React is a separate thing. GraphQL is like the bridge between Magento and the front end, and React is more of a front end technology. So you can have React and you can use GraphQL with React as well.
Okay, nice. Uh, does we can use Magento default frontend as a partially headless with use of GraphQL and web services?
Well, if you think about it, the checkout of Magento has long been headless with the UI components in place. So you can have sort of a system where you can have some pages. So we actually did something like this for one of our clients where their checkout implementation was very complicated. It had a lot of payment methods, it had a lot of shipping methods, a lot of stuff going on. So what we did was we made all the other pages, the product page, listing page, home page, into PWA, and we kept the checkout page as the native checkout page, because that is anyway a headless. So in that case, we separated the concern. We moved one thing to PWA and the other thing was headless. You can sort of play around with it, and you can have a partial headless system as well. It's very much possible.
Right. Next question is, if we are using Magento default frontend, then do we need to disable a GraphQL module of those modules?
No, because it's not actually consuming any resources per se. So it doesn't make, I mean, you can disable it if you're absolutely not using it, but I don't think it makes any difference to the overall performance of the system.
All right. 2-3 more questions. We have time.
Sure.
Can you help me understand the concept behind working on the customer session in the headless Magento?
I mean, is it asking about this specific example which I've given?
No, I think question is like a customer session, how we will manage in headless Magento kind of thing he's asking.
Yeah, so it's exactly this which I've mentioned here, if you see in the slide. So don't use sessions. So if you want sessions, see, usually in the session we don't hold any information. Even for Magento, for customer session, we only hold the customer ID in the session. All the other information can be fetched from the database using the customer ID. So once we use this way to get the customer's ID, then we can get all the other information related to the customer's orders, the customer's invoices, email ID information, everything from the database through repositories.
All right. Nice. One more question. What criteria to consider to go for Magento frontend or to go headless? Good question.
It is actually a good question. So obviously the first thing you have to consider is what the client wants. Does he want, or does he require a headless system right now, or can it wait? The second thing which you have to consider is, as developers, do you have the expertise right now to move this website? So if that website has a lot of moving parts, it might become a difficult thing to actually move the entire thing to PWA immediately. So in that case, what you can try to do, which many people are doing, is that you keep the website as a traditional theme, and then maybe you can use the design exceptions to load a PWA theme only for mobiles, where you can have a very limited experience for the customer.
All right. Last question for the day, if I'll take. How do you choose between REST and GraphQL?
Well, I tossed a coin and I chose and I got GraphQL. No, actually, the thing is, again, it depends on your implementation. GraphQL is better in some ways, I would say, because you can control the response. So one article which I had read, which I forgot which website it was, but it was pretty interesting. What they wanted was their website loading on a TV, or the app loading on a TV will have a different set of data. The app loading on a website will have a different, or a desktop will have a different set of data. Mobile will have a different set of data, and the wearables like watches and stuff will have a different set of data. I mean, different parts of this whole data. They don't want the entire data. So initially what they did was, because you can't do anything, either you have to send all the data and then trim it from the front end, which is bad for bandwidth, or you have to have separate endpoints for each of these, which they initially did. After that, they wrote an article where they said that GraphQL really helped them, because they can now control which data they want back using the same endpoint.
Right.
So that again depends on how you want to implement it. It might be, this might be better, that might be better.
Thanks, Joy, for answering patientfully all the questions. There are so many questions. Still, they are pending. But guys, if you are having these questions, just offline connect with Joy, and I think he will help you there for sure. Yeah. So thank you, Joy, and have a nice day, man. Yep.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.